My wife said she needed independence before committing to a structured future together. I supported her choice, updated the prenup terms, consolidated my assets, and finalized a property acquisition in my name alone. She reached out when independence required financial discipline she didn't expect. I just need to feel like I'm choosing you, not like I'm trapped into a life I never got to try first. She said it like it was gentle, like the words themselves were soft enough that the landing wouldn't hurt. But I sat across from her at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd planned our 5-year roadmap, where I'd shown her the property listings in August, where we drafted what we thought was going to be the framework for the rest of our lives. And I felt the floor shift under everything. Not violently, just enough to know it was no longer solid. "I'm not leaving you," she said, and she reached across and touched my hand like that was supposed to mean something. "I'm just saying I need a beat. A period where I'm not operating inside someone else's structure." I looked at her for a long time, and then I said, "Okay." Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Let me give you just enough context so this makes sense. We were 32 and 31, married 14 months at that point, together for 3 years before that, living in the Pacific Northwest in a house we'd leased while we looked for something to buy. No kids yet. That had been a deliberate choice, a time thing we'd agreed on during year 2 of dating. I work in commercial real estate acquisitions. She had been working as a brand consultant for mid-sized lifestyle companies, mostly remote, mostly self-directed. And when she said someone else's structure, I already knew she wasn't talking about a bad marriage. She was talking about a life that had been moving on a schedule, her words from 3 weeks earlier, a schedule that felt pre-decided. The conversation had been building for longer than I wanted to admit. There were smaller versions of it going back for months. A dinner in February where she said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm on rails." A Sunday in March where she told me she'd been reading about women who took solo travel years in their late 20s and how she'd never done anything like that. A text she sent me from a conference in April that just said, "Do you ever wonder if we moved too fast?" I had responded, "We can talk about it when you're back." We'd talked about it, or I thought we had. Apparently, we'd been having 2 different conversations wearing the same words. "A beat," I said, the night of the kitchen table. "What does a beat look like?" She pulled her hand back. Not sharply, just back. "I want to sublet an apartment. Maybe 6 months. Live alone. Manage my own finances completely independently. Travel when I want. Work on my own terms without the check-ins." The check-ins, I repeated. The general rhythm of having to account for my time. I nodded slowly. "I want to make sure I understand this," I said. "You're describing a separation. I'm describing a reset," she said. "There's a difference." I want to be honest here, because the way I've told this story to a few people, they assume I got angry. I didn't. I've thought about why a lot since then, and I think it's because something in my chest just went very, very quiet. Like a switch had been thrown that I didn't know existed. I'm not a volatile person by nature. I process things inward first. And what I was processing, sitting at that table, was the following. My wife was asking for a voluntary exit from the daily architecture of our marriage, dressed in language that made it sound temporary and mutual, and she had clearly already made the decision before she sat down to talk to me about it. The conversation wasn't a negotiation. It was a notification. "How long have you been thinking about this?" I asked. She looked at the table. "A while," she said. "Months." "Yeah. And you're telling me now because I think if I don't do this, I'm going to start resenting the life instead of wanting it." There it was. That was the actual sentence. Not "I love you, and I want to come back to this stronger." Not "I'm committed to us, and this is about me growing." The actual sentence was, "I might start resenting the life." I filed that away. We talked for 2 more hours that night. She cried once, briefly, when I asked her if there was someone else. She said no, and I believed her at the time. Not because I was naive. Because the request was too internally consistent to be about someone else. It was about her. It was completely, almost impressively, about her. And when she went to bed that night, we still slept in the same room. Nothing changed immediately. I sat in the living room with a glass of water and my phone, and I opened my contacts. I texted my attorney. Not an emotional text. A professional one. It just said, "Need to review the prenup and discuss asset structuring. When can we talk this week?" His name is Dennis. He's been my attorney for 6 years. Handles everything for me. Acquisitions, contracts, the prenuptial agreement that Nora and I had both signed before the wedding. She had her own attorney review it at the time. She'd agreed to all of it. Dennis called me the next morning at 7:45. "Tell me what happened," he said. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She frame it as temporary? Reset, she called it." He said. "And you want to?" "I want to protect myself appropriately, without doing anything dramatic, without escalating. I just want to make sure that if this reset becomes something permanent, I haven't been standing still while she made her decisions." "Smart," he said. "What do I need to do?" Here's what I didn't tell Nora during those first 2 weeks. I had been 6 weeks away from closing on a property acquisition, a mixed-use building in a coastal market, something I'd been working toward for almost a year, due diligence, financing, the whole process. The original plan had been for it to be a joint asset. Her name, my name, part of a portfolio we were building together. That was the 5-year roadmap. That was the kitchen table plan. She'd seen the listing. She'd said she was excited about it. She had also, apparently, been quietly planning a 6-month solo apartment life while I was running numbers on our future together. So I called the financing contact and I said, "We're restructuring this. Individual acquisition. My name alone. Move the closing date back 3 weeks to accommodate the paperwork changes." Dennis and I met in person on a Thursday. We went through the prenup in detail. There were elements that had been drafted with a long-term married couple in mind, some commingled asset considerations, an assumption of joint property going forward, language that would have been unfavorable to me in a separation scenario, given how much my professional income had grown in the 14 months since the wedding. "She make more than you?" Dennis asked. "She makes about 40% of what I do," I said. "And that number has been trending down because she's been transitioning her client base. So she's been earning less while your acquisitions portfolio has been expanding." "Yes. And the prenup, as currently written, doesn't fully account for that disparity," I said. "It was written assuming a more balanced financial picture over time." Dennis leaned back. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Is she asking for a legal separation?" "No. She's asking for a personal reset. But she hasn't asked you to change anything legal." "Correct. So she's operating under the assumption that everything remains as is while she goes and finds herself." I looked at him. "That's an interesting way to put it," I said. "It's also accurate," he said. "Let's talk about what we can do. I want to be clear about something. I didn't do what I did out of spite. I want to be very clear about that. Because when I tell this story, people assume I was hurt and lashing out in the most legally sophisticated way available to me. That's not what happened. What happened was that I looked at the situation with the same clarity I bring to any acquisition. What are the known variables? What are the unknown variables? What is the downside scenario? How do I protect the position while leaving room for the upside? The downside scenario was that Nora's reset was a soft exit that she hadn't finished deciding yet. The upside scenario was that she came back in 6 months and we rebuilt with more honesty than we'd had before. I was prepared to live in the upside scenario, but I was not willing to be financially exposed while the downside played out. She found an apartment about 20 minutes away. 1 bedroom, month to month initially, 2nd floor of a building she described as exactly her energy. I helped her move some things. Not everything. We hadn't categorized who owned what yet. But boxes of her clothes, her home office setup, her collection of plants. I helped her load them into a rented van on a Saturday morning in May. Her friend, I'll call her Becca, was there too. Becca was the kind of person who had strong opinions about what women owed themselves and 0 opinions about what they owed the people who loved them. I'd always been polite to Becca. That morning I was professional. Becca hugged Nora at the curb and said, loud enough for me to hear, "This is so brave." I carried a box of books to the van. "You're not upset," Nora said, when Becca had gone to get coffee. She didn't say it like an accusation. She said it like she was confused. "I'm processing," I said. "You seem very calm. Would you prefer I wasn't?" She looked at me for a second. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe I expected more of a reaction." "I'm going to give you the space you asked for," I said. "That means I'm not going to perform a reaction for you." She nodded. Then she said quietly, "You'll be okay?" And I said, "I'll be fine." The property closed in early June. Single name acquisition. I signed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning and then had lunch alone at a restaurant near the escrow office and sat there for a while thinking about how different that day would have looked 6 months earlier. We had walked through that building together in November. She had loved the corner units on the 2nd floor. She had said, "Can you imagine if we had an apartment here?" And I had said, "Depends on the numbers." And she had laughed and said I was the most unromantic practical person she'd ever met. And then she'd kissed me in the hallway outside Unit 2C. And I had thought, this is the person I'm doing everything for. I thought about that in the restaurant. And then I finished my lunch and went back to work. The prenup revisions were completed and formalized in late June. Dennis had been careful and thorough. We hadn't filed for separation or divorce. There was nothing to file. What we had done was document the current state of assets individually, establish clearer delineation going forward, and removed some of the shared future language that had been built into the original agreement under assumptions that no longer applied. It wasn't adversarial. It was accurate. The marriage was still legally intact. We were still married. She had just chosen to not live as if we were, for the time being. So I had chosen to not structure my finances as if we were, for the time being. Fair, I thought. We had dinner twice that summer. Agreed upon, scheduled dinners. Not romantic in the way dinners used to be. More like business updates with someone you still cared about. The first was in July. She looked good. Lighter, somehow, and she talked about a new client she'd signed. A solo travel trip she was planning to Portugal in September. How much she'd been sleeping better. You seem happy, I said. I am, she said. Is that weird to hear? No, I said. It's useful. She tilted her head. Useful, she said. Informative, I corrected. But we both knew what I'd said first. The second dinner was in August. It was different. She was quieter. She mentioned the Portugal trip had been pushed back because a client project ran long. She mentioned her landlord had raised the rent on her apartment, month-to-month penalty. She mentioned that her income for Q2 had been lower than expected. I listened. I ordered dessert even though I don't usually, just to give us something to do. Are you okay? I asked. Yes, she said too quickly. Financially okay? She picked up her wine glass. Why would you ask that specifically? Because of the things you just told me. She looked at the table. I'm managing, she said. September came and went. She did not go to Portugal. I knew this because she posted on Instagram. She still followed me and I still followed her. We hadn't made any of it dramatic. And the weekend she'd been planning to leave, she posted a photo from a farmer's market 20 minutes from her apartment. I didn't comment. I didn't reach out. I was waiting to see what the actual story was. She called me on a Wednesday night in October. I was at my desk reviewing a lease proposal on the new building. Hey, she said. Hey, are you busy? A little. What's going on? There was a pause. Can we have dinner this week? Sure, I said. Thursday or Friday works. Thursday, she said. I'll come to your side of town. Thursday dinner was not like the other dinners. She came in looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the particular tiredness of someone who has been carrying something they underestimated. We ordered. We made small talk. And then she put her fork down and looked at me directly. I want to be honest with you, she said. Please, I said. The last few months have been harder than I expected. In what way? She exhaled. Financially, mostly. I lost 2 clients in Q3. The apartment costs more than I budgeted. I had some expenses I didn't plan for. I nodded. I'm not asking you for anything, she said quickly. I want to make that clear. I'm not sitting here asking you to rescue me. Okay, I said. She folded her napkin. I wanted you to know. Because I think I owe you honesty. I appreciate that, I said. I think I romanticized what independence would feel like, she said. Yeah. I thought it would feel expansive. And it did at first. And then it just started feeling expensive. I looked at her. What changed? I asked. What do you mean? I mean, what specifically shifted? Was it the money? Was it being alone? Was it something else? She was quiet for a long time. And then she said something that surprised me. Becca is getting divorced, she said. I raised an eyebrow. She filed last month, Nora said. And she's been talking a lot. About freedom. About starting over. And I think when she started going through her own thing, I got caught up in her narrative. I sat back. You're telling me that your decision to take a 6-month reset from our marriage was influenced significantly by your friend's divorce. Not the decision itself, she said, but the urgency, the timing. The timing, I repeated. I've been having feelings about wanting more independence for a while, but I think I made the leap faster than I would have otherwise because Becca made it seem like not leaping was a kind of failure. I looked at my food. I was processing something that I hadn't expected to feel, which was something close to grief. Not for the marriage. For the version of this where she'd told me that 6 months earlier. What do you want, Nora? I said. She looked up. I think I want to come home, she said. The way she said it, it wasn't triumphant or casual. It was genuinely quiet and genuine. and I felt something shift in my chest. Not the same shift as the kitchen table. Different. More like something settling. I want to tell you some things, I said. She nodded. While you've been on your reset, I haven't been standing still. She looked at me carefully. I closed on the property acquisition. The mixed-use building? Yes. That's good, she said. I knew you would. In my name alone, I said. A pause. I revised the prenuptial agreement, I said. Restructured the asset documentation. Made sure that everything I've built in the last several months is clearly and legally mine. She was very still. Why, she said. And she didn't sound angry. She sounded like she was doing math. Because you made a decision about the structure of your life without consulting me first, I said. And I made decisions about the structure of mine. Seems consistent. She stared at me for a long time. You protected yourself, she said finally. Yes. While I was finding myself. While you were on your reset, I said. Which was your choice? I supported it. I helped you move. I had 2 dinners with you and didn't push. I gave you exactly what you asked for. And quietly made sure you weren't exposed. Yes, I said. I'm sorry if that's a surprise. I didn't think it should be. She put both hands flat on the table. So if I come home, she said slowly, what does that look like now? Given everything you've changed. That's what we need to figure out, I said. Together. With full information this time. The rest of that dinner was long and honest in a way that our conversations hadn't been in, probably, over a year. She told me more about the Becca situation. How Becca's marriage had been genuinely bad, controlling, financially imbalanced, documented dishonesty, and how Becca had started framing every long-term partnership as a version of that, and how Nora, in a moment of personal restlessness, had found that framework convincing. I wasn't unhappy with you, she said. I know, I said. I was unhappy with myself, and I made it into a structural problem. Why were you unhappy with yourself? I asked. She thought about it. I think I felt like I hadn't done anything on my own, she said. Like we met when I was 28 and I'd been in relationships since I was 22 and I'd never really just been responsible for myself. Completely. That's a legitimate feeling, I said. But I handled it badly, she said. You handled it honestly, I said. You told me what you wanted. You didn't sneak around. You didn't lie. You asked for something, and I said okay. But then you quietly restructured everything. But then I quietly protected myself, I said. Which is also honest. We didn't resolve anything that night. I told her I needed some time to think. Not weeks. I wasn't playing games, but I needed to sit with the information and come to my own conclusions without the warmth of the dinner and the candles and her looking tired and genuine affecting my judgment. She said she understood. She drove herself home. I sat at the table for 20 minutes after she left, finishing my water. The restaurant was almost empty by then. A server was rolling silverware in the corner. And I thought about the version of myself that had sat at our kitchen table in May and gone very quiet and reached for my phone. I thought about whether that version of me had made the right calls. I want to walk through what I actually did because I think the framing matters. When people hear he updated the prenup and consolidated assets, they assume a cold, calculated punishment. That's not what it was. What it was, a woman I loved told me she was stepping outside the structure of our marriage to evaluate whether she wanted it. She did not ask me to wait. She did not ask me to pause my life. She asked for independence and autonomy for herself, and she framed it as something that had nothing to do with me. So I took her at her word. I ran my life with the same independence and autonomy. I made financial decisions as a single professional because that was, functionally, what I was during that period. I closed an acquisition that I'd been working on, and I kept it in my name because putting it in both names would have required her engagement and her legal signature, and she was engaged in something else. I cleaned up the prenup because it had been written assuming a trajectory that had since been interrupted. None of that was malice. All of it was logic. Dennis asked me, during one of our calls in July, whether I thought she'd come back. I don't know, I said. What's your gut? My gut says she's figuring something out, and she'll finish figuring it out, I said. I don't know which direction she figures toward. And if she figures toward coming back, then we rebuild with better information than we had before, I said. And if she figures away, then I have a clean position and a clear head, I said. Dennis was quiet. That's a very together way to be about your marriage possibly ending, he said. I've been in a lot of deals that fell through, I said. You can't operate paralyzed. He laughed. You're an unusual person, he said. I've been told, I said. The week after the Thursday dinner, I called Dennis. She wants to come back, I said. How do you feel about that? I feel like there are things we need to establish before anything goes back to the way it was, I said. Like what? Transparency about finances going forward. Proper communication structure before any major individual decisions. And she needs to understand that certain things that were joined in concept before are not joined anymore and won't be unless we actively choose to make them that way. You want to renegotiate the terms of the marriage. I want to make sure the terms are ones we've both consciously chosen, I said. Not ones we fell into because we were 28 and in love and didn't think carefully enough. We had a third dinner. This one I planned differently. I made a reservation at a quieter place, no romantic ambience, just good food and decent acoustics. And I came with a list. Not a literal list, but a mental one. Things I needed to say. I love you, I told her before the food came. I want to say that first and make sure it's the clearest part of all of this. She looked relieved. But I also need to tell you some things that are going to be uncomfortable to hear, I said. Okay. The version of our marriage that existed before mate doesn't exist anymore, I said. I don't mean that dramatically. I mean it factually. The asset picture is different. The financial structure is different. The assumptions we were both operating under have been updated. Because of decisions you made, she said. Because of decisions we both made, I said. You made a decision about the structure of your life. I made decisions about mine. Neither of us was wrong for making those decisions. But we can't pretend they didn't happen and walk back into the old house. She nodded slowly. The property acquisition, she said. Is that something I'm just not part of? Currently, yes, I said. Potentially, that could change. But any change would require active, deliberate decision-making by both of us. Not assumptions. That feels like a loss, she said quietly. It is, I said. It's a real loss. And I think we both need to sit with that instead of glossing over it. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain, where a woman bravely asked for some space to grow and her husband, instead of supporting her with open arms, quietly dismantled the financial architecture of their shared life in retaliation. I'm aware of that version. I've heard it, in less direct terms, from people who know parts of this story but not all of it. And if I'm being fully honest, I understand why that version exists. Because the actions do look cold in isolation. Updating a prenup while your wife is at her solo apartment, starting over. Closing a property deal in your own name. Restructuring asset documentation. Looked at from the outside, through a certain lens, it reads like a man building walls. But here's what that version leaves out. It leaves out the text she sent me in April. Do you ever wonder if we moved too fast? It leaves out the fact that I had expressed concerns 3 months before she asked for the reset, that she seemed checked out of the planning conversations. It leaves out the dinner in February where she said she felt like she was on rails, and I said, talk to me about it. And she said, I don't want to ruin dinner. And we moved on, and I let us move on when I should have pushed. It leaves out Becca's divorce and the way Becca's narrative had been scaffolding itself around Nora's restlessness. The whole picture is messier and more human than either version, mine or the villain one, makes it. We were two people who loved each other and communicated just well enough to feel like we were communicating and just badly enough to completely miss what the other one actually needed. We started seeing a therapist in November. Not couples therapy, exactly, though it became that. It started as individual sessions for her that she invited me into. The therapist's name is Dr. Park. She's measured and precise, and she has a way of reflecting your own words back at you until you hear what you actually said instead of what you meant to say. The first session I attended, she asked me to describe what I had been feeling the night of the kitchen table conversation. Quiet, I said. I went very quiet. What does quiet mean to you in that context? It means I stopped expecting. Stopped expecting what? I thought about it. A future that looked like the one I'd been building toward, I said. I think I mentally filed it under no longer guaranteed and started operating accordingly. And how quickly did that happen? Pretty much immediately, I said. Dr. Park wrote something down. What does that tell you about yourself? She asked. That I protect myself by moving fast, I said. Yes, she said. And what does it cost you? That question sat with me for a long time. What does it cost you? Because the honest answer was, maybe the chance to be heartbroken. Maybe the chance to be in it, fully and messily, while it was happening instead of watching from a step removed behind decisions and documentation. Maybe some version of intimacy that I'd already half departed before she could depart from me. I'm not a cold person, but I am a person who responds to potential loss by creating order. And there is something in that. Dr. Park and I spent a few sessions on it. That isn't entirely about the situation. It's about me. It's about the particular wiring that makes me good at my job and sometimes, in the wrong moments, too efficient in my life. Nora moved back in January. Not all at once. Over a few weeks, box by box, which felt right. The same way she left, almost. Reversed. The plants came back. The books came back. Her coffee mug that I'd kept in the cabinet because putting it away felt too final. It came back to its spot by the espresso machine. The first morning she woke up in our house again. I made breakfast and she sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and I brought her coffee and she looked at it and then looked at me and said, "Thank you." Not for breakfast. I knew that. Of course, I said. The property acquisition remains in my name. We discussed it. She said she understood. She said, "I don't have a right to argue with that." And I said, "You'd have a right to raise it." And she said, "I'm choosing not to." We are actively building again. New roadmap, new conversations, new agreements. Some things that were going to be joint are joint. Some things that are mine. And we have both, explicitly and on the record with Dr. Park present, acknowledged what those things are. No more assumed futures. No more plans that one person makes while the other is quietly planning something else. Becca, for what it's worth, has since acknowledged, Nora told me this secondhand, that she had been, in her own words, a little evangelical about her divorce and the philosophy it had given her. Becca is not a bad person. She was going through something real and painful, and she reached for frameworks that felt like they applied universally, and they didn't. I've never been angry at Becca, but I've thought about the role that other people's unresolved things can play in the decisions people we love make. About how someone else's truth can become a louder voice than the life right in front of you. Nora asked me, sometime in February, whether I had been angry. Not in the moment, she said. Not at the kitchen table. At any point, she said. While I was gone. I thought about it. I had a moment in August, I said. After the second dinner. When I drove home and sat in the driveway for a while. What were you feeling? I think it was anger, I said. But mixed with something else. Something more like, wasted. Wasted. Like I had invested a lot of care and planning into a picture of our life together, and it had just been set aside, I said. Not destroyed. Just set aside. Like it didn't warrant more than a conversation and a packed van. She was quiet. That's fair, she said. I'm not saying it to punish you. I said. I know, she said. I'm saying it's fair because it is. We are not back to where we were. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect a reconciliation story to end with a full restoration. A return to the status quo ante, love triumphant, all wounds healed. That's not what happened. What happened is we are something different now. More deliberately constructed. Less assumed. The intimacy is different, more careful, maybe, or more chosen. We don't just move in the same direction because we live in the same house. We actually talk about the direction. And there's something that feels more solid about that than the original version, though it costs more to build. There's a thing I want to say about the financial decisions I made, just because I think it's important to be accurate about my own motivations. I did not update the prenup to punish her. I updated it because I was, during that period, functionally a single professional making significant financial decisions, and I needed my documentation to reflect reality. I did not close the property in my name to exclude her. I closed it in my name because including her would have required her active participation, and she had opted out of active participation in our shared life. I did not do any of it as a move. I did it as an honest reflection of the circumstances. And when the circumstances changed, when she came back, when we rebuilt, when the conversations became real again, some of those structures remained and some opened up. That's how I approach everything. The circumstances inform the structure. The structure doesn't force the circumstances. There was one moment that I keep coming back to. It was during one of the Dr. Park sessions. Nora was talking about what she'd realized during the months she was alone. She said, I think I thought independence would feel like freedom. And it did at first. And then it just felt like loneliness with better interior design. Dr. Park smiled. I looked at Nora. And I said, I think I knew that about you. She looked at me. What do you mean? I think I knew that the loneliness would catch up with the freedom. I didn't say it because it wasn't mine to say, but I think I knew. Why didn't you try to stop me? She asked. Because stopping you would have answered the wrong question, I said. The question wasn't whether you could leave. The question was whether you wanted to come back. Nora looked at me for a long time. And you structured everything so that the answer to that question would be genuine, she said slowly. I structured everything so that if you came back because you chose to, I said. Not because you had to. That's the part people miss, I think, when they hear the surface version of this story. The prenup updates, the solo acquisition, the asset restructuring, none of it was designed to trap her out. It was designed to make the return, if there was a return, a real choice. Because I didn't want a wife who came back to me because the alternative was financial difficulty. I wanted a wife who came back to me because she actually wanted to be there. And I needed to make sure the architecture of our finances didn't muddy that answer. She needed to know she could survive independently. She needed to feel it, not just believe it theoretically. And she needed to come back, if she came back, to a person who hadn't spent 6 months waiting by the window. Nora read the updated prenup, eventually. I gave it to her in January, before she moved back in. You should read this, I said, before you decide anything. She read it at the kitchen table. It took her about 40 minutes. I made coffee and worked at my desk and let her read. When she was done, she came and stood in the doorway of my office. This is very thorough, she said. Dennis is good, I said. You really did do all of this while I was gone. I did. She was quiet. Does it bother you that I did? I asked. She considered it honestly. No, she said. It would have bothered me if you'd done it before I said anything, out of distrust. But you did it after, because of concrete circumstances. Yes, I said. It actually makes sense, she said, which I didn't expect to feel. I didn't do it to make sense, I said. I did it to be fair. To yourself, she said. To both of us, I said. Fair futures require honest foundations. She looked at me. That's very you, she said. I know, I said. And she laughed, and it was the first time I'd heard her laugh in months, and it sounded right. The last thing I'll say is this. There is a version of a marriage that people build assuming it will stay the shape it starts as. And there is a version that people build knowing it will change and planning for the change honestly, and building agreements that account for who the people in it actually are rather than who they wish they were at 28. We are trying to build the second version now. It is slower. It is less romantic in the moonlit wedding speech sense. But it is more real. And real, I have come to understand, is what I actually wanted. Not the shape, not the 5-year roadmap, not the projected portfolio or the joint property or the kitchen table plan. I wanted a person who chose the life, consciously, fully informed, with all the exits clearly marked and still walking through the door. She found out what independence cost. I found out what patience looked like when it wasn't passive. And we are, as of now, choosing each other. On purpose. With documentation.